Hello, Northstar here with another Singularity Let's Play. Oh darn, looks like people did the nonsense they waited the last second to grab stuff in the cheese exploration. I definitely should have made it to top 250, which is my usual goal for the mutagen points, but oh well. I get screwed by pricks who at this point just have gaming the rankings, make it hard to know how much you have to invest time in this to get a given ranking range. All the time. Like I said, I just try and make the top 250 for those mutagen points. That's all I'm asking. It's not too much, you would think, but no. There's people who just want to. I mean, I guess it makes sense they want to get the ranking for the minimum of effort. Can't blame them. I don't know. Just having a finite number of spots at the top is stupid. There should just be some set goal everyone has to make so they're competing against themselves. But, the dev of this game comes from like New York City. Is intensely capitalistic and all about competition. Of course, when you have a winner take all game in the real world, someone wins, a lot of people lose, and the system doesn't work for most people. I actually just learned today that the German economy is, at least as of early June 2025, has actually been in a recession and shrinking. Their GDP has been shrinking, which is a very deep recession. Usually recessions just mean stagnant GDP growth. Um, so this is a particularly bad one. That's surprising, although I guess that explains some of the rise of like the AFD fascists and such. Um, it's probably driven partly due to lack of energy imports from Russia because the West is absolutely, well, the United States and its European allies is obsessed with bringing down Russia and balkanizing into a million little pieces so that it can exploit each of them, divide and conquer, and put military bases on China's western border because Russia and China share a border, and then attack China because it's a plan for world domination. Hopefully, it doesn't work. And honestly, I hope there's peace in Ukraine. Um, that would be by far the best. Have people stop dying in that war. There's a lot of vicious. Russia was just so bad. That's just nationalistic crap. People are dying, and there are no good guys in this conflict. You've got Zelensky who goes around taking government control of the media, crushing trade unions, selling off state assets and corrupt deals to Western capital. And then you obviously have Putin, who's someone who assassinates his political opponents and interferes with, well, U.S. elections, though the U.S. constantly interferes in everyone else's elections. So people act that that's a unique evil or ridiculous. And of course, that's become a canard for Democrats who can't face that their center left ideology is collapsing. It's not doing anything to help ordinary people, and it's driving people to both the far right with like Trump and to the left with actual socialists and social democrats like Bernie Sanders. Bernie is not a socialist, despite what he says. He is a social democrat. Uh, and, particularly support for Israel, for Gaza genocide, that absolutely hollowed out the Democrats' support and caused them to lose the 2024 elections. It's not just people who didn't vote one way or another, it's a lot of the most enthusiastic supporters of the Democratic Party. Hold on. Sometimes I swear when I talk about certain things, OBS just stops recording. It recently reset all the input channels, and it's probably just, you only notice it when it does that. It does it more often, but I don't notice unless I'm talking something that those powered. Rather, I don't. But yeah, it's the Democratic Party is a big tent left of center party, um, which is controlled by party bosses who are essentially beholden to billionaires and don't allow things to move more in a certain amount left, such that the Democratic Party acts as part of a ratchet effect with the Republicans, where the Republicans make things worse and shittier and more right wing, and then the Democrats prevent things from being returned to how they were before the Republicans took power. They slow walk repairing any of the damage or undoing stuff like tax cuts to the rich, the point that the country just gets toward more and more right wing with every generation, every decade. Well, decade is there haven't been that many generations since this thing really got established in about 1980. That since Reagan won, the Democrats have filled this role with moving to the right, getting the wrong message from Reagan's victory. When there's actually a lot of part of the reason Reagan won is because Democrats are putting up these shitty center left people no one wanted, and so they moved even further to the right in response because neoliberalism, which the Democrats are neoliberal, the Republicans until Trump, who's a fascist, were also neoliberal. Neoliberalism is a center right ideology that actually dominates Democrats, despite it being a supposedly center left party. But neoliberalism is it's brain rotted like this. It's an ideology where no matter what happens, the people who are fans of it will take anything as evidence that they were right, and therefore moving further to the right. Uh, cut welfare, cut taxes, cut the size of government institutions that protect ordinary people further and further. Now you get occasional concessions the Democrats do make to the left, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that Obama did, or um, occasionally, working with the trade unions. But this is not the dominant ideology of the Democratic Party. These are concessions they make to their left wing. The dominant ideology is like Hillary Clinton-esque, do coups in Haiti and dominate the world, but do it in a way that's racially, gender equitable in the United States. That is, give women and black people the chance to dominate the rest of the world if they're Americans. Meanwhile, horribly fucking over much of the third world, which is very brown. Um, it's a hypocritical, vicious ideology, neoliberalism, and it's based on the hack economists like Mises and Hayek and Milton Friedman. Actually, I used to have some respect for because he seemed smart and actually had his stuff together, unlike the other hack neoliberal economists. He also won the so-called Nobel Prize in Economics, but there is no Nobel Prize in Economics. That's actually a PR stunt by the Central Bank of Sweden, which created a, quote, Nobel Prize in 1969. That real Nobel Prizes were created in the 1800s. The Nobel, quote, Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics is funded by a bank, the Central Bank of Sweden, which even though Sweden is a fairly left-wing country, their central bank has historically been sympathetic to fascism and very right-wing, which is one of those weird contradictions in Swedish politics, because social democrats control the vast majority of politics in that country, although it's moving right and have for decades. But the central bank is full of like these neoliberal pricks who are much further to the right than most of the population or politics in their country. Probably because they insulate themselves from politics, and the social democrats don't dare and try and purge these neoliberals, which they should. They should move from the central bank, because the central bank there is doing very ideological things that is only pretending to be non-ideological, but it's not, and is actively interfering in politics. So if they're not going to be apolitical, why should the parties leave them alone? And creating this fake Nobel Prize is just one example. I say fake. They've even been sued to change the name, Central Bank, and so they changed the name in some of their documents very slightly, emphasize the Nobel Memorial Prize, but I guess calling it the Nobel Prize is not trademarked or something, so they were able to get away with it. But it's not a real Nobel Prize. It's not given on merit. It's given for ideologically biased reasons to right-wing economists to move politics throughout the planet to the right. And this is part of why things have sucked since, really, I mean, the inflection point is about 1971, 72, which is not long after this prize was created. It's one of the many things the end of the Bretton Woods global banking system, the creation of fake Nobel Prize economics, um, certain inflection points in the Soviet Union and their politics, all these things combined. Oh, the Sino-Soviet split, let's not forget that. Um, I mean, the world has been fucked for a long time. Things are just finally coming to a head. But the seeds of decay were planted a long time ago, like 1971, 72, 69 even. And Vietnam War played a huge part in that, which should surprise no one. That was a shitty event, and that it would do lasting damage, not just to America but to the whole world. Um, with the way political alliances were and the way that it gave Nixon an excuse to tear up Bretton Woods' global banking system. So the U.S. essentially gained monopolistic control of the global banking system because Bretton Woods gave the U.S. control, but it didn't have a free hand to do anything it wanted. There were restrictions on what the U.S. could do. After that, in Bretton Woods, the U.S. was able to do things like put unilateral sanctions on countries, just prevent countries from doing trade, freeze their assets in ways that were not within the power of the United States. It used to be before then, if you wanted to do sanctions on a country, you had to convene the UN Security Council, usually, and all the countries had to agree. That was the way to do effective sanctions. After Bretton Woods, the U.S. could just very effectively sanction anyone they wanted. And this was used endlessly to bully third world countries, to dominate them, to continue the practices of neocolonialism. Countries are nominally independent, but economically they're horrendously exploited and not really free. And if their leaders do things that work too much against U.S. interests, they get assassinated or a coup gets organized. This is most infamous in Latin America with the so-called School of Americas. School of Americas, often named the School of Assassins, where the U.S. in Fort Benning, actually, Georgia, would train Latin American usually like colonels, majors, who would then go back to their countries, work up the ranks with the skills they learned, and when they got to be generals or chiefs of the armed forces of countries, they would often do coups and put in pro-U.S. governments. They were also trained in torture and counterinsurgency tactics as well, both of those things. So this was deeply unethical, deeply, and the fact that it was so closely affiliated with the U.S. military being based at Fort Benning should be a surprise to absolutely no one who's paid attention to history. This is part of U.S. imperialism. Um, it was eventually shut down and renamed. It's essentially the same institution. I forget what the hell they call it now, but it's really still the School of the Americas, just with a different name. It's slightly different leadership, but just moving to a slightly more racially inclusive, slightly better concealed version of the same thing, because there was some part of the reason it was shut down was to get a distance itself from a name that becomes so tainted. Everyone knew the School of Americas was horrendously evil, so create a new name, same thing, just a rebranding, and at the same time be a little more forward looking on racial issues, because the U.S. military, who these people were working alongside, is increasingly one of the best ways for like poor black kids to get out of poverty and such. There's a lot of people who become Army career officers or enlist and become sergeants or warrant officers. I actually knew some of these people when I was in Army. I were to sea for a while. They were not fans of U.S. imperialism. However, they were like indifferent to slightly critical, usually. Not horrendously critical, but they didn't like it. But it was a job. It was a job they were willing to hold their nose and do. But because of what's known as the poverty draft, areas in the U.S. that have intergenerational poverty, places like the poorer slums of Hartford, Connecticut, the poorer parts of Chicago, the poorer parts of Detroit, and the only way to get out is often through the military. It's a way to feasibly be able to afford college, because if you go and take out mass amounts of student loan debt, which the war on drugs actually helps deny access to student loans to poor black kids very often historically, because if they were convicted on minor nonviolent drug offenses, they'd be ineligible for federal student loans for college usually. So this is one of the ways that that de facto and sometimes corrupt police officers would plant drugs on black kids, just arrest them. So this is one of the ways that de facto black people are kept down. And if they wanted to be able to afford college, they would need like GI Bill kind of stuff. I mean, the GI Bill is not nearly as good as it used to be, but the military was still a way to help maybe pay for college or at least get enough money to leave these very poor areas with terrible schools, rampant crime, etc. This is part of why I was in ROTC. I knew about the poverty draft. I knew people suffer under this kind of poverty and they have no choice but to enlist. And I was hoping to bring some semi competent leadership. I was specifically interested for quite a while in military intelligence, which is a running joke in the U.S. Army in terms of how incompetent it is. So I figured I could do better than the average person who goes into that, who usually they're not very smart. They're It's not a great way for career advancement. It's not the hardest specialty in the army to get matched with. So it doesn't attract the best and the brightest. Uh, and I'm very intelligent. In fact, I going in my career path towards trying to become a physician right before I got disabled with long COVID. I had a professor who was also an advisor because advisors teach classes too. But he taught me. He had also been my academic advisor, and he said I was one of the, and I actually record this because it's so easy to live in a world where you'll have assholes who would doubt this ever happened. I wanted to, for posterity, make sure that I could go back and hear this again sometime. Recording from my own personal records. I don't know. I worry sometimes. I mean, it's not like I don't think anyone cares. I made a recording of a phone conversation, but he said it was one of the brightest students most brilliant students he'd ever had. He was, of course, at the time trying to encourage me if there's any way I could finish my program despite my long COVID. I'm like, no, I can't. I can't think clearly. I'm far less capable of handling complex ideas than before long COVID. Or having the energy to remain active for more than a handful of hours a day very often. I struggle to do like 3 hours of recording a day on YouTube here. Sometimes 4. I mean, there are better and worse days, but if you listen to my channel for a while, often by like what's the 4th or 3rd video of a day, I sound like I'm drunk or something because I'm just so tired with my long COVID. Mind you, that's only sometimes 3, 4, 45-minute videos in. That's sometimes only by less than 3 hours of real work in a day. That's how bad my fatigue is with long COVID. On a really good day, I might manage 5 or 6, but those are like, we're talking once every couple months. I might have a day I'm not healthy, where my symptoms are less. It's bad. It's rough. And the government's not doing enough to try and come up with a cure for long COVID. I mean, this is part what I think the government thinks if it doesn't fund it, private industry will come with a cure. But if it does, it'll probably cost millions of dollars. And Medicaid, which is getting its budget cut, and is the only thing you really get if you're too sick to work. Disabled people rely on Medicaid and pretty much nothing else unless they have like a family member who's got private insurance. They can be on that, and that costs money. But short of family help, you're stuck on Medicaid if you're disabled, and there's no way Medicaid will pay for whatever private industry wants to charge for a cure. But the government may use this excuse, say there's a cure, it exists, and force people into like, I don't know, long-term payment plans where pretty much they get healthy and go back to work, but then all the money they ever make goes to paying back for the cure. Like that's a best case scenario, and a much more likely scenario is that there is no cure for long COVID that gets developed because it's just private industry is uninterested in this kind of thing and knows that if they did come up with a cure, a lot of people would probably try and find ways to evade the debt. Like if they become literal wage slaves to the debt of a ridiculously jacked up price cure, you'd probably see people fleeing to other countries and just disappearing after getting cured. I mean, maybe. Um, Especially when the U.S. is going fascist, that's why people would be leaving the country anyways, as ways to escape persecution. Like, I would very much like to become a refugee to any country that will take Americans, but nowhere is taking Americans as political refugees yet, because I am worried as a socialist, as a Marxist, that the bastards will come for me someday. Uh, I mean, they've even there's even been like FBI and NSA tapes that harassed the guy just second thought came to his door. But that's not what I'm worried about. Just phone call and stress or stressful conversation at my door is not the worst thing that can happen. It's just irritating and meant to intimidate. I more like making it illegal to say socialist things and coming like on a no knock right in the middle of the night and throwing a bag over my head and bringing me to what's essentially a concentration camp with conditions so bad I'll die. That's the kind of thing I'm afraid of, because that's what fascists do. Eventually, once their grip on power, their hold on power is solid enough, which will be quite a while if that's the case. But why wait till what 10 or 12 years from now when things are that bad? Why not get out as soon as possible and get my life reestablished somewhere else while I'm younger? Before, in my mid 30s now. Before I'm like in my 50s or something, I have even less physical energy with my long COVID. It'd be even harder to establish myself somewhere else. We'll see if I can get out. Maybe eventually some country will realize that the U.S. is a valid place to accept refugees from who fear future persecution before it actually happens. Fortunately, I doubt it because all of Europe is blaming immigrants for their problems, but it's not immigrants' problems. It's not the reason Germany's economy is shrinking. If anything, their economy would be shrinking even faster if not for immigrants. Um, the more immigrants you have, the relatively lower wages are. I know people claim otherwise, and there's ways to bias the math to show otherwise. Um, but if you have an economy over time, if you have a finite labor supply, it will move to more capital intensive industries where, increased investment in various types of capital, whether it's facilities, human capital that is like training people up to graduate education levels, or machinery, AI, whatever you're investing in, to a capitalist economy will run out of labor with economic growth, pushing it to the point where it stabilizes around like 3 to 5% unemployment, which capitalist economies almost never eat up that last percent. There will always be a certain number of unemployed people under capitalism. And then when there's no more labor, if immigration isn't growing the labor supply, then a functional capitalist economy, which many capitalist economies aren't functional anymore for a number of reasons, including consolidation, that is the formation of giant monopolies, often which own a bunch of air quote brands. So you buy a bunch of different things, different names, but they're all actually made by one company. Um, like I looked at, I've got some Folgers coffee, and I was looking at it, and it's owned by Smuckers. It's like, yeah, it's they don't call it Smuckers coffee, but it is Smuckers coffee essentially. um, and you see this all the time, like just companies buying up other companies. But anyways, that can undermine this tendency. But theoretically, a functional economy should move towards more capital intensive businesses, investing further to get more productivity out of the finite supply of laborers so you can extract just a little more profit. And because automation and investments in capital in this, it usually yields relatively low returns on investment. And that's the other thing. Globalization means that capitalists can invest overseas, building brand new factories in places where labor is very cheap instead of moving up the chain towards more capital intensive business in their own country. Um, Instead, further developing their own country so wages will remain stagnant and such. And in fact, the pressures of globalization can actually cause wages to remain stagnant even as productivity does go up some, which is what's happened in the US since about 1972 and the end of Bretton Woods. it's not a coincidence that that's the point where things diverge, because it allowed the U.S. to run a massive trade deficit without it hurting the rich too much, and instead all the pain of this massive trade deficit and this massive government deficit as well, because the government was spending far more money than it was bringing in, mostly in the Vietnam War. All the pain of this ended up falling on working class people under the new global banking system uh, that just kind of came into being after the end of Bretton Woods. It was never formalized. It was an international conference to come up with a new system, the same way Bretton Woods was formed when Churchill, FDR, and Stalin sat down together in like 1944-45 and drew up Bretton Woods, which was a system that was meant to be fair, to not allow the U.S. or any other top dog to abuse their power in smaller, weaker economies that were still developing, like the Soviet Union, because Stalin was rightfully concerned that the United States would abuse its dominant position after World War II otherwise. Bretton Woods prevented that, and the Soviet Union had the second highest long-term GDP growth rate in the planet. That is, when you look at how much the economy grow from the beginning to an end of any given 5 year gap in time. 5 years are just it's a good metric for longer term GDP growth rate, and it gets around problems like with capitalist economies, they can shrink and then grow and then shrink and grow, and you can get averages are misleading. If an economy doubles in size 1 year, then loses half its value the next, or loses half its value then doubles in size, either way you'll get a average GDP growth rate of 20 plus 25% a year, but at the end of 2 years, the 2 year growth rate is 0%. There's been no change in the size of that economy at all. That's the example I like to give because it's extremely easy for ordinary people to understand that math. If you can't understand that, just sit down and write it out. You'll see plus 100% minus 50. You average those two numbers together, you get plus 25%, but the economy hasn't grown 25% a year. It's grown not at all. It's just the fluctuations of capitalist free market that give the illusion of growth. And so, like, Germany's economy is shrinking right now, but it'll be growing again later. And if you just do annual growth rates and just average them together over a bunch of years, you get the illusion that their economy is growing faster than it really was when it was losing value during these years. But if you look at the long-term growth rates, I suspect the long-term growth rates are still positive, but they're so not 0%, but they are probably a lot less than what the annual average growth rates will look like if you're averaging between, say, the years 2015 and 2030, somewhere down the line, and averaging 15 1 year intervals instead of 3 5 year intervals. Yeah, the Soviet economy grew slower than the West during boom years, but faster during bust years. That is, the U.S. would grow quickly, then it would grow slowly or even shrink, then grow quickly, up, down, up, down. You can see this if you look at charts of economic growth. Even though the long-term trajectory was up, the percentage rate of long-term growth was less than that of the Soviets, who just slow and steady grew a little bit each year and actually outpaced the U.S. that way. And they would have, before the end of Bretton Woods, they were projected to eclipse the U.S. economy by like 2030 or something. It was common consensus among economists that it was not a matter of if, but when the Soviet economy was bigger in both absolute size and GDP per capita in the U.S. But then the Bretton Woods end of that, it really hurt the Soviet economy. And even though it was continuing to outpace the U.S., it was not outpacing the U.S. by as much anymore. And so projections of the point where the Soviets would eclipse America ended up being like 2050, 2080, 2100. And there were serious and correct doubts that the Soviet Union would last that long if it remained behind the U.S. that long, even though it would eventually still get bigger in terms of its GDP. And even once it reached parity, the U.S. would have been ahead so long that it would have built up lots of institutional experience with advanced things that, from being a wealthier country, it would have built up lots of military strength from having more money spent on acquiring military assets. It would have done a lot of things to solidify its dominance. So it would have taken a long time for the Soviets to displace the U.S. as top dog, even after their economy was bigger. Just like China's economy is now bigger in absolute terms than that of the U.S., but it'll be generations before that wealth can translate into actually being a more powerful country. Takes a long time. Have It's not just like a race and one nation had a head start, um, and the other started behind, which is what you get when you compare, say, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the U.S. and China today. It's also a race, one nation a head start, and then the nation that was further ahead was like, I don't know, earning money based on how far ahead they were in the race the whole time or something, or each nation earning it based on how much distance they covered. That might be a better example. And then you're comparing who has the most money in the bank at the end. Even if one nation pulls ahead eventually in the race, that is the rate of gain of wealth due to higher GDP. It still takes a long time for that to translate into more actual wealth and more power. Um, it will happen eventually, but it's going to be a long time until China is more powerful than the U.S., until it has military technology that's anywhere near the level of the U.S. and so forth. And it will happen. You get ridiculous things like, oh, Chinese fertility rate is below replacement levels. Assholes. China's fertility rate has been below replacement levels since the end of the Cold War. It actually, their fertility rate had fallen until about 1988. Then it went up a little. I think, was it from 87 to 88 or 88 to 89? And it was probably would have continued to go back up. But then the Soviet Union fell. And even though the Chinese and the Soviets sort of hate each other, they were both communist. And so this did weaken the China's position in the world strategically, and they probably cut back on investments that helped ordinary people. And you got stuff like Tiananmen Square and stuff as a response to those cutbacks in domestic investments of various sorts, and kind of forcing a certain amount of austerity on ordinary people in order to maximize trade surpluses and invest in infrastructure and such. Austerity for, actual benefits instead of austerity in the West, where it's usually just so the rich can get richer. But yeah, Tiananmen Square was almost certainly a result of these cutbacks after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the decline of it. And had it quite fallen yet, but it was obvious it was going to at that point. I'd have to check exactly what year it happened. There's a lot of propaganda around it, ignoring the massive amounts of violence that was done actually by some of these supposedly peaceful protesters against troops. There was not a lot of violence on the square itself. There were some warning shots fired by soldiers, and I think one person was injured. But on the streets leading up to the square, there were people throwing Molotov cocktails into armored personnel carriers, by which I mean people climbing up on top of the APCs and throwing them inside essentially these metal boxes that had soldiers inside. People got severe third-degree burns from this. Many of them actually did survive because I think the government, taking care of its actual veterans, gave very good health care to these soldiers. They're all conscripts in China usually. But like, unlike the US, where if you had gotten horribly burned in your line of duty like that, like if you've been in the National Guard, went to protest and someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail and horribly burned you, the U.S. would screw you over. We do not care for our veterans, and a lot of them end up homeless and shit. But yeah, they got good health care and a lot of them survived, but they were horrendously burned. So this was not a peaceful protest. And in fact, some of the leaders of the protest, many of whom sought asylum in the United States or U.S. allied countries after they left the country, openly talked in interviews. This is a matter of public record about how they were trying to provoke Chinese government into a crackdown into violence. through their actions while trying to portray themselves as peaceful, but they were not peaceful. Um, and most of the violence did not occur in the square itself; it occurred in the streets laying up the square. And there were atrocities committed on both sides. The Chinese troops were not faultless. Some of the soldiers did shoot into the crowds. These people were throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at them. So it's a little bit like the Boston Massacre that led to the American Revolution. You actually had a group of unruly colonists throwing rocks and broken glass bottles at British troops, and they fired into a crowd. And then this was falsely portrayed as just a ruthless, unjustified massacre of colonists in media that was in large part controlled by wealthy mercantile interests in the US that wanted independence so that they could be the ruling class in the country instead of a faraway group of elites in Britain. Um, However, something good came out of that. There's no question that something good came out of that, and that the US was a much more equitable, egalitarian country than the British Empire for over 100 years. Although it did drag its heels in getting rid of slavery, which the British had actually abolished slavery, I think, like 30 years before the U.S. Civil War. Um, so it was not without its serious drawbacks, but there were some positives. Give me you're tired, you're poor. Immigrants from all around the world able to come to the U.S., especially after the Civil War. In the period between 1865 and 1895, there was, or let's say 1910, because actually there's a lot of it around the turn of the century. There was an immense amount of immigration. Some of my ancestors on one side of my family came then. Others came in like 1600s to the United States. I kid you not. But different branches of my family. Um, the latest arrivals were like Ellis Island. Will not matter. Trump and like the fascists are probably trying to deport me. If they can for my political beliefs. Doesn't matter I'm white. Doesn't matter that I'm one of the oldest families in the country on one side. Um, Actually, multiple branches that go way, way back on one side of the family, and then the other is much more different ethnic identities of my mother's and father's side of the family too, which is not uncommon in America that people marry someone of an entirely different, like, you know, English and Italian, German, and French, like unthinkable matches in Europe where people are still very subtly racist and don't like marriages between different ethnic groups. Happens all the time in the United States. So you get real, like I'm a real European mutt. I can trace my ancestry to pretty much every country in Northern and Western Europe. Not much of Southern Europe, actually. It's not really Italy or Spain or Greece, but almost every single country that's Northern or Western Europe, I have some ancestry from. Except the Nordics. I don't think I have much Nordic ancestry either. But everything south of the Baltic, including England and all the British Isles, every one of those, Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland. Um, it's a huge hodgepodge, which is why it becomes maybe slightly misleading for him to say I'm like a 16th generation America, and certain branches of the family am, and others it's like ninth generation or something, seventh. It's much less, but it's still been here a long time. And now thinking of becoming a refugee, and would have been interesting if I made it to Europe and then had kids someday, and then it's like following that genealogy back to the United States and then back to Europe again would have been a freaking interesting thing, but it's never happening. Disabled with long COVID. No one really wants to date someone like this in the U.S., and I'll probably never be able to get out of this country because I doubt any country will provide asylum. My only hope is this YouTube channel gets to where I can monetize it and where I can earn enough, because it can't be just like $100 a year, where I can earn enough that I can declare myself self-employed and resell to European countries with an actual like work visa, because it's very hard to be a refugee, but it's much easier to get a work visa. And then eventually become a citizen of whatever country and learn the language and assimilate as best I can. If I knew what country would accept me ahead of time, I'd try and learn the language before even. I'm not great with languages. I really struggle with them, but I put in as best effort I could. Um, I probably never sound anything like a native, but I shouldn't have to die in this country just because I struggle to learn new languages. And the United States, it's at the very least going to horrendously oppress people like me, disabled, with the cuts to Medicaid and such. Kick a lot of people who should be on the program off, make it very hard to prove you're disabled, make the reporting requirements extremely onerous, so it's hard to keep up with. And with my very low energy levels, I'll almost certainly miss deadlines and stuff, and then they'll kick me off. Even if I can prove I'm disabled, they make me re-report it every 3 months or some bullshit. I'll almost certainly get kicked off anyways. Um, as if it was just gonna change my being disabled from month to month. It's ridiculous. Um, but that's like what was done in like in the states in the country, United States. I'm just gonna say that the states was like Tennessee or something. There were a couple of states that did Medicaid work requirements before, and that's what ended up happening is extremely onerous reporting requirements, and a lot of people who should have been qualified for Medicaid being kicked off because it's not really about removing freeloaders. It's about fucking over the poor, even people who are working, and especially people who are disabled who can't work, who are caregivers for small children with health issues, those kind of things. Um, the Republicans are vicious, but the Democrats, don't get me wrong, the Democrats are not the good guys. They don't really want to undo the damage when they come back to power, if they ever come back to power. If there are free elections in the U.S. again, air quote free, choice between only two parties, with any other parties acting as a spoiler. Spoiler effect prevents for those not who don't really understand this, the U.S. has first past the post voting. So if you have an election, whoever gets the most votes wins, even if they don't have a majority of the votes. And the way this effectively works, that's for congressional or senatorial races, and for the presidency, there's the electoral college. So votes are worth more in certain states than others, and it's winner take all for a particular state. So you can even get fewer votes than your opponent and still win, as has happened multiple times in the U.S. Whereas like a Congress race, you have to get most votes, but that's not a fair system either. You could have something where like for a congressional race, the Republicans get 40% of the vote, the Democrats get 39% of the vote, and then everyone else votes for a third party that's to the left of the Democrats. So they're more ideologically aligned with the Democrats and Republicans. In a fair system, you would have ranked choice voting, and the votes from that third party would be redistributed to Democrats, and Democrat would take office. Or even more fair, you have proportional representation where you'd actually have a lot of floating seats for, say, Congress. You might have 10 reps. And so if the distribution of votes is, let's say, 40, 30, 20, and 10%, I don't know, voting for tiny parties. But let's say the major parties, it's 4% Republican, 30% Democrat, and 20% some big third party, and then lots of little ones that are like 1%, 2%. In a proportional representation system, you would have ones that didn't make it to 10% threshold get redistributed among the rest. And then, the big third party with 20% of the vote would get two, or possibly, depending on how the third party votes are redistributed, especially if you mixed in ranked choice, 2 or 3 seats. Democrats would get 3 or 4, Republicans would get 4 or 5. That's fair because it doesn't silence voices that are not just of only one of two parties. It allows, groups like socialist parties to have an actual say, or the Working Families Party in the United States, or the Libertarians, or the Greens. These parties have no voice in America. It's not a democratic system at all. It really isn't. It's an oligarchy, and the two-party system is a tool by which the plutocrats who are in charge of that oligarchy maintain their power. Because you get billionaires who donate to both the Democrats and the Republicans, and so it doesn't matter who wins. They control um, they control the politics. They control the candidate. The candidate is beholden to either way, no matter who wins. There may be smaller third parties and more ethical and refuse to take their money, but it doesn't matter because those third parties can't win under our rigged system. Um, Under a system that's first past the post like this, third parties get no representation. So even if they are more ethical, and there's no way the Democrats or Republicans will ever stop taking billionaire money. You also get this intense fear that if they stop taking that money, maybe they get displaced as one of the two leading parties. Like the Democrats fear if they stop taking billionaire money, maybe the Green Party would become the opposition to Republicans. So they will never stop taking the billionaire money. Um, and the billionaires effectively control everything. It's horrible, and it's gotten more obvious with billionaires like Elon Musk, in charge of Doge, actually holding offices now. But just because it's more transparent that the billionaires control things doesn't mean it hasn't been this way since at least 1980 or so. The U.S. is a failed democracy that controls, of course, a lot of the indices and rankings, so it doesn't get ranked that way by NGOs, but it is. It's a failed democracy. It's an oligarchy. Um, and there was this famous, I think it was a Princeton study, or Princeton and MIT, that showed when they looked at what would set statistical rules, what would qualify as an oligarchy, what would qualify as a democracy. The U.S. fails the test for being a democracy. It's an oligarchy, a plutocratic oligarchy, because they created several categories of oligarchies, which it actually made it even easier in a way to qualify as a democracy because there wasn't just one of two categories. Interest-based oligarchy, plutocratic oligarchy. So interest-based would be like citizen groups can have a say if they form into like grassroots organizations, but they have no say individually. Whereas a small number of whoever leads, citizens for this or whatever and what they found is that almost all the political influence was held by the very rich, and a small amount was held by interest groups and labor unions. Like we're talking like 9% of the effective political influence, political power in the country, and the rest, like ordinary voters, just voting their wishes, like held like less than 4% of the effective political power. So the best chance you have of making your voice heard as an ordinary person is by joining a labor union, is by joining a grassroots organization that works towards something, whether that's the NRA or it's a left wing, organization to abolish firearms in schools, or it's the Sierra Club environmentalist group. These are groups that allow people some influence, but many of these organizations are even organized in ways that are fundamentally undemocratic, where much of the membership has no real say in how the leaders of these organizations wield the limited amount of political influence they have. Um, and they can be co-opted by rich donors as well. So this is, while it's your best hope of being heard, it's not even that's not perfect. Trade unions are probably the closest thing you're going to get to a really truly democratic means of. But even the union bosses can be bought out by uh, the corporate bosses, the people who are supposed to be oppositional to. They can in fact get bribed by them and work for the corporate bosses while pretending to oppose them. Happens all the time. This is capitalism. It subverts every attempt at democracy in the long run, and it's more advanced, more further down that rabbit hole in the U.S. than many places. But yeah, the U.S. dominance won't last forever. The Chinese economy is already bigger than the U.S., and people, as I said, alluding to, they fear monger, or they create propaganda to make people. It's the opposite of fear mongering. It's actually fear mongering being, oh, China's going to own everything. This would be more. They create imperialist propaganda to make people believe that the U.S. dominance is assured, even though that shows the opposite. Um, they'll say, oh, China's fertility rate is below replacement levels. That is true, but it's been below replacement levels since 1992, after it started falling sharply with the end of the Soviet Union. And so basically, there was a huge decline in birth rates from like the 60s till the like 88. Then it started to go up again. Then it stabilized like in the late 80s. Chinese birth rate was starting to go back up. Then the Soviet Union fell, and it fell again to well below replacement levels. And ever since, after this kind of valley, that was the lowest it's ever been. The fertility rate has been climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing each year in China. So it's getting back towards replacement levels. And this is one of the only countries on earth where the fertility rate is climbing, and one of the only developed countries for sure. I mean, there may be some third world ones, but you see, like in US and Europe, generally speaking, you don't see this. You might see individual years where it goes up, but you don't see this tendency towards the birth rate actually stabilizing at a sustainable 2.1 fertility rate, I should say. It's going back towards that in China, and it will eventually reach. This trend has been going for decades now. The Chinese birth rates have been coming back up. So they will eventually, because their government is investing in things that make ordinary people's lives better, they will eventually reach neutral population growth or neutral birth rates where their population neither shrinks nor grows. It will shrink for a while, but most people point to China and say it's overcrowded. Well, if their population shrinks, it'll be less overcrowded. And at equilibrium birth rates where the population neither shrinks nor grows, which are actually a little bit below replacement 2.1 for a while because medical technology means the elderly are living longer. So it'll reach equilibrium even before it reaches at least in equilibrium with the improving medical technology, even before it reaches like that magical 2.1, and it will reach that 2.1 eventually too, which means China's economy will eventually, China's population after shrinking will eventually begin to grow again. But it'll begin to grow from a much lower number and very slowly probably, so it's not going to have massive overpopulation issues either, because Chinese leaders are thinking long term. And socialism, to the degree it exists in China, helps their system, helps invest in ordinary people. If you see my Alpha Centauri Let's Play series, a planned economy in that game leads to higher population growth rates. Of course, in that game, you never really get the problems of demographic collapse and your population shrinking unless your food production is inadequate. Even though in the real world, you have populations that shrink with sufficient food production all the time. So it's kind of unrealistic in that way. But yeah, planned economies do tend to have higher population growth rates or at least slower declines than otherwise be the case for that level of economic development, because richer countries tend to have lower birth rates, which is why the fact that Chinese birth rates are coming up, their fertility rates, I should say, their absolute birth rates may be going down because their number of people of childbearing age is still shrinking from the past very low fertility rates. But the fact that fertility rate is coming up over time, even though their country is becoming richer, is a very hopeful. It indicates there's no way their system is going to collapse. Because generally, if a country, all things being equal, if it becomes wealthier, the fertility rate will go down, not up. Soviet Union actually was also had problems with fertility rates that were well below replacement levels by the end. This was partly due to a massive, massive investment in women's education and rights. So women in the Soviet Union were able to enter into the equivalents of PhD programs and have real careers way before women in the United States could, for instance. They were decades ahead of the West for most of their history, although they were less and less. The United States really started to catch up in the 70s with various movements. The sexual revolution changes women's status in the U.S. That was when the Soviets had previously been about 20 or 30 years ahead of the U.S., and the gap closed to about 5 to 10 years. It was a much smaller gap after the 70s. But the Soviets remained ahead of the West consistently in women's rights and women's educational attainment, to the point where you have problems when the Soviet Union collapsed of women with PhDs suddenly being forced back into being house mothers, because capitalism is much more misogynistic, and the collapse of socialism and the reinstitution of capitalism in Russia led to women who had been PhDs and quite, as I said, quite literally, partly because of the skyrocketing cost of childcare, being forced back into the home, into the kitchen. It's ridiculous. The level to which everything regressed in Russia with the end of communism. Yeah, there were some very good things happen in the Soviet Union, even though there were some very bad things happen in the Soviet Union too. I'm not putting the Soviets on a pedestal as perfect. They weren't. They were a one-party state, and they were politically repressive. And real socialism, and not like people are like real socialism. Right, I'm a Marxist, but I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. Lenin's theories of democratic centralism led to um, democratic centralism says that all the socialists should merge up into one party over time. That invariably leads to one party state. I mean, it's literally the stated goal of democratic centralism is to have there be only one socialist party. The one party state that results has huge problems with corruption and people feeling that they don't have power in their lives and in the economy and in the government, which is the opposite. Socialism is supposed to be about empowering ordinary people and giving them control of the economy and over the government, neutralizing the power of billionaires because there are no billionaires under socialism, where the workers control the means of production, which is where China gets interesting because they have billionaires in China. But what happened with the Sino-Soviet split is the all right. You got to understand a little about Chinese history. You got modern Chinese history. You got to go back to Mao. Mao created his theories of quote socialism of Chinese characteristics, which gets dissed on by a lot of orthodox Marxist-Leninists. So I know I'm Maoist, Marxist-Leninists, and they have some points, but the basic idea of Maoism is that the peasantry, that is the farmers, because peasantry is a name people in the United States don't like, but the farmers, the small farmers, okay? You know what a small farmer is. The small farmers can be a revolutionary group. It doesn't have to be urban factory workers who lead to a revolution. The farmers can do it too. That was the basic idea that Mao took and ran with, and that was in stark contrast to traditional Marxist theories, Marxist-Leninist theories that said that the revolution will come from the factory workers and the urban office workers and these kind of groups. It won't come from the farmers. That the farmers are too beholden to backwards religious beliefs and too socially conservative, and they won't want a revolution. Mao proved them wrong. The revolution in China did come from the peasantry. He was correct. In that way, he actually validated Bukharin's theories. Bukharin was part of what was known as the right opposition in the Soviet Union. And one of Bukharin's chief ideas was that the revolution could occur from the peasantry and at the weakest links of capitalism, i.e. third world countries, which is exactly what happened in the Cold War. Most of the countries that had socialist revolutions were third world countries during the Cold War. Whether the U.S. cracked down on them or not, it was very rare for wealthier countries. One of the wealthiest countries that ever went socialist was Chile, where they actually elected a socialist government. That was not socialism by revolution. That was socialism, or even socialism by peaceful revolution, like mass strikes and protests. That was socialism via electoral means. Salvador Allende winning the election in Chile. Actually, he was minority elected, so he got less than half the vote. But the vote in Chile was split between more than like two parties. It was like 3 or 4 way split. And even though I think there was a system where a ruling coalition could have come together, that his opponents couldn't work with each other. Even though most of the other parties were capitalist, they could not come to agreement, a power sharing agreement. So the socialists formed a minority government in Chile, and Salvador Allende began instituting a socialist agenda. And then the CIA, enraged by this, and Nixon enraged by this, he literally is quoted as saying, "Make the Chilean economy scream." He worked to squash the Chilean economy, and he sent CIA to assassinate people who were loyal to the government. I have to take a step back. The CIA tried to do a coup in Chile even before Allende took power, and it failed. Failed horribly. It never got off the ground. Like, internal maneuvering within the military high command prevented there from being any troops who tried to march on the capital or anything. So the CIA identified which generals had been opposed to the coup. They assassinated a couple key ones. One of them famously they were trying to supposedly kidnap, but ended up getting killed in a failed abduction attempt. But whether they were going to abduct the guy and torture him or have him disappear or just kill him, it didn't matter. They neutralized the loyalists to the government. Meanwhile, the State Department and Nixon worked to sabotage the Chilean economy, cutting them off through. Nixon had just canceled Bretton Woods, so the U.S. had created a global economic shock and suddenly had enormous unilateral power over the global economy that other countries hadn't yet figured out how to deal with. And so he cut Chile, which is traditionally a food importing country, they do not produce enough food to feed their own population through most of their history. They might now, but at that time they had been before the socialists came to power, a food importing country. The United States cut off Chile from food imports. The only country that would still trade with them was Mexico, and Mexico was experiencing a famine at the time. Not one that was to the point of mass deaths. There were, I think, a couple thousand deaths total. It was a small famine, but to the point that they could no longer afford to export food to Chile, and every other country, either through U.S. pressure, refused, or through the U.S. seizure of Chilean assets and freezing and sanctions and such, was unable to sell food to Chile anymore, thanks to U.S. Economic pressure. And so, combination of food shortages, the assassination of loyalist generals, and the distribution of anti-socialist propaganda in the Chilean military, where there were literally these anti-communist pamphlets that the CIA was distributing in the barracks of Chilean soldiers, led to a successful military coup. And this is how Augusto Pinochet became the dictator of Chile. But Allende was a democratic socialist, a Marxist, but not a Marxist-Leninist. Someone actually very much after my own heart ideologically. And Allende was, he was couped. He actually killed himself as Pinochet's troops were marching on the Capitol building. It not completely. It wasn't like he took an AK and actually he fought a little bit, and then when he was getting pushed back and like alongside the people were defending the Capitol building, and it was clear that the building was going to be captured, he like went into a back room and shot himself in the head instead of, or was it the chest? It doesn't matter. He shot himself rather than being captured by Pinochet and tortured and probably forced to make false statements because he believed so much in socialism. He was willing to die for the cause. And yeah, it's that's bravery. All of it. Even then, I do not condone people killing themselves. It's a bad thing. But the fact that to the bitter end he was dedicated to his ideals, and I think it's a little different if fascists are closing on your position and they're going to torture you, dispute a black site and torch you and make you say things that aren't true about your supposed past crimes that you never committed and such. Like that's what fascists have historically done when they've captured the elected presidents of countries, is had them make false statements that they were working against the people and stuff. It's not true ever. Um, I think that's a little different, um, to say the least, than some person doing it out of depression or something. There's always, hope unless you got literal fascists storming the building and like, I don't know. And you're the leader of a country. That's a very special case. Anyways, and I'm not condoning what he did even then. I'm just saying it's understandable that he would end it that way. Anyways. I'm not condoning it, but I'm not condemning it. I'm just neutral on this. I hope freaking YouTube might try and censor me just for even saying that, but that would partly be for ideological reasons. They don't want anyone praising Salvador Allende because YouTube is owned by billionaires, just like the rest of social media. And so if they, they'll be biased in their enforcement of rules. But anyways, hopefully, assuming that they don't try and block this video from my even dare saying that Salvador Allende was brave to the end. He was an elected socialist. This is what I want to emphasize. He did not take power through violent means. He didn't even take power through like strikes and collapse in the government, which is peaceful revolution, which is not calling for violence to support peaceful revolution, and it may be very often the only way socialists can ever hope to establish a more just society. But in Chile, even the military, large parts of it were fiercely dedicated to the Constitution. It was the constitutionalists that the CIA assassinated. And so it was possible for socialists, the system was not rigged against them to such a degree it was impossible to win a free and fair election. And they did, even if it was a minority win. And they were helping ordinary people, and they would have probably won re-election with a different leader, because norms against, I think it's most countries where it's 6-year presidencies and you don't do re-election. I would have to double check what the exact rules were. But another member of the same party probably would have won re-election by landslide because assuming they could have gone around the U.S. economic sabotage and coped with it well enough. Because cracks were starting to show in those sanctions. Countries were finding ways around it to sell food to Chile and such. It would not have lasted forever. And people rightfully would have blamed the U.S. for the pain that was being inflicted on them. It wasn't the socialists' fault. So they might very well have won re-election. And it was never a fair shot to begin with Big Brother U.S. doing everything in its power to prevent democracy from operating. Which is why they may have actually been smarter to ally with the Soviets, even though the Soviets were not ideologically aligned with democratic socialism. An alliance of convenience against the United States would have protected them in many ways from what the U.S. did to them. Anyways, so but I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, but I am a Marxist, and yeah, socialism has the only real answer to the flaws of capitalism, which will otherwise lead to quite possibly the extinction of the human race with climate collapse. We are headed that way. So, as for China, they're weird. They had the Sino-Soviet split though, which in the 70s I think I was mentioning, which led to a number of changes, including the China gradually opening itself up to foreign direct investment, especially with the opening up and reform or whatever they called it. There was a specific name for this. What was that, under Deng or something? And this is actually, when you look at it from a strategic perspective, part of what led to China really going hard on decreasing birth rates, because they were trying to develop their country, and their leadership determined they needed to cut birth rates and increase wages in their country. And by having fewer people to care for, it'd be easier to do a good job caring for all of them. And that the Soviet model would not work in the long run; it would collapse, which they were right about. Um, and if they wished to survive as a socialist country, they needed to a certain degree, work with the capitalists and allow them to open up factories in some of their coastal cities and such. But the government retained control of a large portion of the economy in the form of state-owned enterprises, which are to this day an enormous part of the Chinese economy, and agricultural cooperatives, which are often undervalued. And they're certainly undervalued by people when looking at GDP, at the value of production. Farmers don't Food is a nation cannot survive without food, but it's often undervalued in various ways, uh, but strategically incredibly important, and provides a lot of jobs. So when you look at employment figures, a lot more employment is in the public sector, is in the state-owned enterprises and the agriculture cooperatives than is GDP in China. And the agriculture co-ops, which are basically, they're not as hardcore as the Soviet collective farms, but they are socialist organizations of agricultural production. And although they have allowed limited amounts of capitalist investment in the agricultural sector as well, but sorry, there's a fly here, but the agricultural co-ops, and government retains control of the big banks and infrastructure, and including electricity providers, and eventually they have plans to renationalize a lot of the coastal capitalist-owned industries. That is, to take control of them again and bring them back under state control. Which, that's another thing many people will try and falsely say, "Oh, that's not socialism, that's state capitalism." Well, the difference between state capitalism and centrally planned state-run socialism is whether the government is controlled by the people or not. If the government is controlled by the people, if democratic processes mean that the government represents the people and not some class of billionaires, then state control of the economy is socialism. But if the government is controlled by the billionaires and then the government in turn controls large amounts of industry, then that is state capitalism. Um, Problem is, though, China is a one party state, similar to the Soviet Union, and ultimately that's a huge, huge weakness that I think does place the Chinese socialist project in great peril. Um, they ideally need multiple competing socialist parties, which is something that Lenin's theories do not allow for. Um, Lenin's theories became predominant in the Marxist world because he was the only one who successfully did a socialist revolution after World War I, or during, actually. There were socialist revolutions across much of Eastern Europe, and some of them were run by people with more democratic socialist ideas who wanted to have multi-party democracies, but with maybe only banning capitalist parties, so you would have multiple competing socialist parties, or allow them to exist but strongly regulate them, prevent them from getting donations from billionaires who've been dispossessed of their assets. I mean, they're companies, but still had a lot of assets or such. There's various different ideologies, and there were various countries that could have had socialist revolutions but didn't, like Italy, which didn't even have a failed one. Just nothing, no attempt of the socialists. There were the 2 red years in Italy, and there could have been a socialist revolution, but there wasn't. Um, but Lenin successfully established a socialist state in the Soviet Union, and what became the Soviet Union like 3 years later, after there was actually a transitional government, and it wasn't straight Russian Revolution, Soviet Union. The Soviet Union proper was established in like 1921. The Russian Revolution was years before then. There was a period of chaos and relative weak government, not anarchy, but upheaval. Like the period of anarchy in Civ 4, if you ever play Civilization 4, when you change governments, you get like a couple turns, which can be varying number of years depending on how many turns you are into the game, of anarchy. Wasn't really anarchy, but it was a period of weak government and upheaval while things became what would become the Soviet Union. Uh, and there was a civil war that occurred, the Russian Civil War with the whites, and foreign invasions of the Soviet Union, including U.S. troops landing in the Soviet Union during the Russian Civil War, something that is not taught often in history classes, that we invaded the Soviet Union in its infancy, just as it was being born. There was an international coalition of British, American, Canadian, like all these different countries, and they invaded the Soviet Union and tried to overthrow the emerging socialist government and failed. Although that didn't stop them from doing horrendous things like using chemical weapons, gassing whole villages. There was Churchill, who was not yet the leader of the UK, but had been I think he was the Minister of Munitions, and then he became like the Secretary of something or another, Secretary of War or something. He was climbing the ranks of the British government. He would eventually become the leader of the UK. And he was in a position, he'd helped develop chemical weapons when he was the Minister of Munitions, and then in his role that he had just gotten promoted to out of role as Minister of Munitions. I think he started his career in the British Navy and then Minister of Munitions. Anyways, but Churchill actually ordered the use of the very chemical weapons he had helped develop as Minister of Munitions on a small Soviet village near Archangels during this period, for instance. So he gassed like 1,000 civilians. And this is, it's a war crime. Churchill, who ordered it, should have been sent to, did the Hague exist then? He should have been tried and hanged for what he did, though. He killed like 1,000 people with nerve gas, essentially. Or chlorine gas, or God, I don't remember what the chemical operation was, but it was a crime against humanity, and Churchill should have been tried, found guilty, and executed for his crime. That was a horrible thing, and the fact that he just got away with it with very few repercussions is horrific. Of course, it was an era where the British Empire was doing much, much worse things all around the globe, and it still was an empire. The British Empire didn't die until after World War II. And this was before World War II. This was right after World War One. The British Empire was in the slow process of collapse at this point, but empires in collapse are often the most vicious and brutal. In fact, some of the worst crimes the British ever did, they did in the period between World War One and World War Two. Gassing villages, setting up concentration camps. That yes, the Nazis were inspired by the British concentration camps. That plus Jim Crow laws in the U.S. South. The rules again, the laws that discriminate against Jews were inspired by Jim Crow, and the concentration camps were inspired by British concentration camps and some of their colonies during the period between World War One and Two. Of course, it didn't actually go directly to the Nazis. It went, the Italians actually copied these techniques first, and then the Nazis copied the techniques from the Italians. The Italians used them in Ethiopia, which they invaded like 1936 or something. They invaded Ethiopia, and they used concentration camp techniques there that they had copied from the British. And then the Nazis, very soon thereafter, started making plans to build concentration camps, and they got the idea from Mussolini. So Mussolini used it not to kill people within Italy for their beliefs so much as, although he did actually disappear and kill a number of socialists, but that was more death squads in the night kind of thing. He used it to subjugate the Ethiopians. He rounded up whole villages of Ethiopians and sent them to concentration camps in order to depopulate areas where there was a lot of insurrection against the Italian colonial rule, which was completely unjustified, just invasion of a country to set up a colony there. I mean, this is completely unjustified. They had every right to resist the Italian fascist government, the Ethiopians, and Mussolini had no right to put them in concentration camps or to gas whole villages, which he did. When he wasn't, when the villagers resisted, he gassed them. When they didn't resist, they were deported, like as violently. They were deported to concentration camps, where many of them died in forced labor camps and horrific conditions. Some of them survived, but not a ton. And those who survived were broken people who had been through so much trauma that the hope was that they wouldn't ever be capable of resisting the Italians again. Of course, history proved them wrong. Many of them did turn around and were angry at Italy and sought their revenge, and good for them. Fuck the fascists. Mussolini was an evil bastard. But anyways, of course, they weren't really released from the camps very often until the end of World War II. Mostly the ones who got out and resisted escaped from the concentration camps, because, you know, escapes did happen. Anyways, enough about like all this bits of kind of history lessons. Some of it's difficult to hear about, so I hope you folks enjoyed the video. I didn't even get to what I was going to talk about with genetic technology, and can we really trust big corporations with this stuff? And there's a lot of powerful stuff that's coming down the road, just as with AI. Yeah, go watch my Alpha Centauri Let's Play series in the new videos, which I guess they won't actually be out till September. So somewhere down the line, if you watch that series, you'll hear me talk about genetic technology. And yeah, you can't trust giant corporations with it. Like, the stuff like GMOs are not inherently dangerous, but companies like Monsanto cannot be trusted with this very powerful technology. And let's not even get started in like techniques of retroviral engineering and gene editing and all these things. Like, the thing that our capabilities grow, but the morality of the people we trust with these technologies does not. For-profit corporations cannot be trusted with any of this any more than they could be trusted with nuclear weapon stockpiles. All right, well, anyways, wish you all the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star to lead you home. Adieu, and best luck.